Chaverim, you may be seated. So I've been pondering what I wanted to say to you this morning. Let me tell you what I'm not going to talk about. I'm not going to talk about the Texas legislature's attack on our religious freedom. I did that on Saturday. I'm not going to talk about the rising tide of anti-Semitism that is spreading through the globe. It is, but that's not our biggest problem. I'm not going to talk about Iran and the threats to Israel that surround it, even though they do. I want to talk to you again instead about a more existential crisis. We are living in a critical moment in history, but we don't all know it, and some of us choose to ignore it. It's hard to know what future historians will consider to be a pivotal moment in history. History does not announce itself and say, this is the moment when your children and your grandchildren will ask what you did, what choices you made, and what you failed to do. Rosh Hashana is a moment of hitorarut, of waking up, about hearing the clarion call and answering. In the Musaf service that we will do in a few moments, we will sound the shofar again, and after each sounding, we will say, Hayom Harat Olam. Today, the world was brought into existence. Rosh Hashanah has become, in part, a day of commemorating creation. Though intriguingly, according to the Midrash, Rosh Hashanah does not commemorate the first day of creation, nor the second, or any of the days in between until it gets to the sixth day. Rosh Hashanah, according to the Midrash, celebrates not just the birth of the world, but the birth of humanity, and with it the beginning of our responsibility for the world that was created. Rosh Hashanah is thus an opportunity for us to reflect on the story of creation. Not just the first one, but both of them. In chapter 1, we are told that we are the pinnacle of creation, and in fact, it is that idea that undergirds the Midrash. The story of creation there gives us mastery over the world that God has given us. But that is not the end of the story. For immediately following in chapter 2, we are given our marching orders from the Holy One. Our role in God's creation is le'ovda u'leshomra, to guard it, to use it for the benefit of all. We are named as God's stewards. The story of creation defines our relationship to nature and has to direct how we treat it. There's a wonderful cartoon, Frank and Ernest. It often depicts the goings-on in the realm of heaven. And in one particular moment, we see God looking down at the earth, and a cluster of angels surround him, and the Holy One is shaking his head and going, I should have gotten a security deposit. I'm not sure that would have reined us in. We have fallen incredibly short of our role as stewards of God's creation and as partners in the process of creation. And so today I want to talk to you about the ultimate existential crisis. Because if we don't solve it, then solving the problems of Israel, of anti-Semitism, of religious freedom will not matter. So let's talk about climate change and our role and responsibility. It is clear that nations around the world have delayed far too long in curbing fossil fuel emissions, that most scientists are of the opinion that we can no longer stop global warming from intensifying over the next few decades. We've already heated the planet by almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit since the beginning of the 20th century, largely by burning coal, oil, and gas for energy. The consequences can be felt across the globe. This summer alone, blistering heat waves killed hundreds of people in the United States and Canada on the western coast. Floods have devastated Germany and China. Wildfires rage out of control in the western United States and in Siberia and in Turkey and in Greece. This past week, we have witnessed the devastation caused by Hurricane Ida in Louisiana and its aftermath and its flooding in the Northeast. And that's only the beginning. According to the report recently issued by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a body of scientists convened by the United Nations, they determined that even if we started sharply cutting emissions today, total global warming is likely to rise around 3 degrees Fahrenheit within the next two decades, and a hotter future is locked in. The report leaves no room for doubt that we are responsible for global warming, and that essentially all of the rise in global average temperatures since the 19th century has been driven by nations burning fossil fuels, clearing forests, and loading the atmosphere with greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane that trap heat. These changes in climate have little parallel in human history. The last decade is the hottest the planet has seen in 125,000 years. Our world's glaciers are melting and receding at an unprecedented rate, not seen in over 2,000 years. Atmospheric levels of carbon dioxide have not been this high in 2 million years. We cannot turn away from our responsibility or ownership of the crisis we have created. Ocean levels have risen 8 inches on average over the past century, and the rate of increase has doubled since 2006. Heat waves are significantly longer than hotter than they were in the 1950s. Wildfire weather has worsened. Bursts of extreme heat in the ocean, which kill fish and seabirds and corals, have doubled in frequency since the 1980s. In Israel, Dr. Pinchas Albert, part of a group that authored a report published in 2018 in the International Journal of Climatology, talks about how the Negev will expand northwards, but that will not be the major concern that Israel will have to deal with, even though the potential for encroachment could reach as high as Tel Aviv. He says the greatest danger to Israel is the already increasing temperature, which has gone up by more than 0.5 degrees per decade since the founding of the state. And that is 5 times the global average of 1 degree per century. Predictions from the report for the Middle East and for Israel specifically are of more consecutive dry days, fewer wet days, a decrease of almost 100 millimeters in precipitation in most places, an increase in evaporation, in flooding, and in extreme weather, and by 2100, a sea level rise of about half a meter. On my last visit to Israel, we drove past the Dead Sea. It was shocking to see how much it had declined. But even more frightening was the decline in the Sea of Galilee, the feeder to the Dead Sea and source for so much water in Israel. Our ingenuity and our creativity in desalination and other techniques that better use water in Israel may serve us well, but they are not a panacea to the real problem. Too much water in some places and far too little in others. If we look back to the story of creation, we know that at the end of each day of creation, God looked at what he had wrought and declared it tov. In fact, the Hebrew word tov occurs 7 times in that very first chapter. Again and again, after speaking the world into existence, God saw that it was good, and when it was fully complete, very good. That repetition of tov is a reminder to us that at the end of the day, God truly revered the creation and hoped that we would too. There's an incredible midrash, almost 2,000 years old, that tells about how, after creating the first human beings, God took them on a tour of the Garden of Eden. He showed them the plants and the animals and introduced them to the myriad aspects of creation. Look, God said to Adam and Eve, look at my creation, see how beautiful and perfect everything is. I created everything for you. So make sure you don't ruin or destroy my world, for if you do, there will be no one after you to fix it. There will be no one after you to fix it. We are created in the divine image. We were given dominion and responsibility. We were told to be stewards and guardians. And the story of creation is our way of perceiving not only God's role in the world, but our role as God's stewards. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel asked us to look at the world and see the same awesomeness in it that God did, that Adam and Eve did as they first toured the magnificent world that God had created. We are asked to focus on our relationship to the earth and our responsibility to the future. As a proverb born, from best I can tell, somewhere in the 1970s, we do not inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children. In Yiddish, there's an expression, alles für die Kinder, everything for our children. And this is an everything for our children moment. For if we do not act seriously now, then what we leave them will be a reason for them to question our commitment, not only to God, not only to the earth, but to them. There's a cleaning supply brand called Seventh Generation. It comes from the Native American idea that we should think of the impact our chemicals and our actions have, not just for our children or our grandchildren, but down the line for 7 generations. We have to act now for them so that we bequeath to them a world that is in better shape than it is today. Let me suggest a few things that I think we can do. The first is to recognize and accept our responsibility for what is taking place. We need to appreciate the urgency that if we are to survive on this planet, we must stall the march of climate change and slowly, inexorably begin to reverse it. If we don't, then all of the other problems that we face as a Jewish community will not matter. And it's not just about individual action. Most climate experts believe that what we do as individuals is not enough. And is certainly, as a Jewish community, we will need to go beyond our potential to do it by ourselves. After all, as a community, we account for only 2 out of every 1,000 people on earth. And so we can't do it alone. But our tradition calls for tikkun olam, for repairing the world. And that is a responsibility for each of us individually and collectively to do what we can to repair our broken world. Nigel Savage, the founder of Chazon, a Jewish environmental group, suggests that first and foremost we need to take climate change as seriously as we do anti-Semitism and the other things that bring us to the foreground. A deeply serious public commitment not to finishing the task, as our passage in Pirkei Avot reminds us, but we are not exempt from starting it as a central pillar of Jewish policy and of Jewish practice. We are in the first day of the Shemitah year. The Shemitah year was a year in which the land was allowed to lie fallow, a reminder that the land and the earth belonged not to us but to God, and that we were its stewards and had responsibility for taking care of it. The Shemitah year is the beginning of a 7-year cycle. And so, let it be the beginning of a 7-year commitment that will transform our globe. Individual choices matter. What we eat, what we drive, how we power our homes, our businesses, and our institutions all impact on the world around us. We need to be much more conscious of the choices we make. Eating a pound of beef, and for those of you who know me, I love a good hamburger. Take me to any restaurant, good fleishik restaurant, and Jody will tell you, I'll spend 15 minutes looking at the menu and then order a hamburger. But eating a pound of beef, the production of which releases 13.67 pounds of greenhouse gases, is far, far worse than eating a pound of wild salmon, which releases only about 0.23 pounds into the atmosphere. There's also an opportunity here for us to support Israel in a way that most of us hadn't thought of. Aleph Farms recently announced that it is increasing production of its faux meat. its cellular meat to 5,000 burgers a day, Aleph is one of the leading companies worldwide for the creation of meat by growing it from cells from otherwise living animals and thereby bypassing the exhalation of greenhouse gases. And Aleph is only one of such companies in Israel. I'm curious. According to reports, the burgers they produce are juicy and tasty, and they're fleishik because they're meat. We can make choices that make a difference. But ultimately, this is something we cannot do by acting alone or even collectively here at Temple Israel. I hope that one day soon we'll be able to return to Kiddush in the social hall instead of grab and go under the portico. But when we do, we have to have green Kiddush. We need to look at our building and our facility and think about how we can do better. I will tell you that one of my pastimes around here is I run around turning off lights. It's funny, but it's not funny. We're really, really not very good. We leave lights on in the sanctuary and the social hall and in the lobby and in the stairwell. I don't even know some of the places we leave lights on because I can't even find the light switches. And that's just us. And I don't think we're unique. So each of us, individually and institutionally, have to do better. And ultimately, we also need to recognize that only by influencing governments, both on a local, state, and national level, will we be able to really forestall the serious impacts of climate change in the future. We as a Jewish community have shown an incredible ability to punch above our weight class when it comes to influencing policy on Israel and on issues which resonate with us. We have to make climate change no less a concern, and when we take it on as a cause, we will be able to impact significantly on the decision-making process in our country. We are facing an existential crisis, but we also hold the key to solving it. Ours is a tradition of faith and of hope and of responsibility. We are God's partners in the perfection of the world. We are God's partners in the upbuilding of the world. And so on Rosh Hashana, a time to wake up, a time for hitorarut. It is a call for each of us to do our part. It's time to wake up and use the hope and faith of our tradition to galvanize us into saving our planet, not just for our own sake, but for the sake of our children and our children's children and for all generations to come. Amen. Chaverim, let me invite you to return to our Machzorim. We rise as able and continue with Chatzi Kaddish in the middle of page 123.